1891, 32-year-old professor, mountaineer, scientist, and explorer John Norman Colley would begin his descent down the summit of Ben Macdui, the second highest mountain in Scotland and the UK right after Ben Nevis. Now John, he was a pretty influential man in England, known not only for his mountaineering, but also his sharp analytical mind with a wide range of interest. It's actually thought he was the inspiration for the world-famous character Sherlock Holmes. So suffice to say, John's word carried a lot of weight, and he was not prone to exaggeration, which is important because of events that would happen this day. As John was making his way down from the summit, he would begin walking through the mist when suddenly he heard something. Every few steps he took, he would hear a crunch behind him, then another. For every 3 to 4 steps John took, this, whatever it was behind him, would take huge steps of its own. John, ever the intellectual, told himself this was nonsense, there was nothing behind him. But he listened again, and again he heard these huge footsteps behind him. So he stopped to look, but the fog was so thick he could not see a thing. He continued walking again, and as he moved on, he heard the crunching of footsteps behind him. John now began to feel creeped out, and as it got closer, he could no longer take it. He sprinted off as fast as he could down the mountain. He would stagger about 4 to 5 miles through boulders and blinding mist before he made it to the forest, where he was safe but very shook up. And this experience led to him never returning to this mountain. But it would take nearly 34 years before John would speak of it, when he gave his account to a group at a climbing club dinner, and it soon leaked to the press. John would surprisingly get numerous letters from other mountaineers who had experienced the same thing. And of course, skeptics came out early and put a squash on the whole story. But the main issue for them was that John was an accredited scholar, and his word was deemed so reliable that many people believed the claims. But there would be another issue that came up for the believers that gave some doubt, because shortly after this, the many other climbers who had wrote John started to come forward with their own encounters on Ben Macdui. One of these, a Hugh D. Welsh, said he hiked to the summit with his brother in 1904, and throughout the day and night they heard footsteps that seemed to be walking through water-saturated gravel. They also felt that something was near them, but they could never see it. But with all these other climbers coming forward, it begs the question, why now? Again, that goes back to John's reputation. Now that he was speaking out about it, these other climbers felt that they could bring their stories forward without the fear of ridicule. But of course, there's also the skeptical take that maybe these climbers were just coming out after John so they could get a little publicity and maybe cash in on their claims in the hopes of exclusive interviews. Regardless, the story would die down, but it would be brought back to the forefront 20 years later when a man named Pete Densham was participating in rescue work in the Cairngorm Mountains nearby of Ben Macdui. While doing this, Pete would encounter the oh-so-common mist the climbers often see in the mountains, and it's here that Pete would begin hearing unsettling noises. He couldn't see well because of the mist, but whatever was walking around him was getting closer and closer. And like in the story with John, Pete could no longer handle the fear and took off running to escape whatever it was. Coincidentally, Pete knew a fellow mountain climber, his friend, Richard Frere, who just 3 years later wrote about feeling a presence that felt intensely real. And instead of hearing footsteps, he actually heard something singing with an intensely high note. Richard would also write the account of another hiking friend who wished to remain anonymous, who recalled camping at Ben Macdui and woke up to feel a sense of dread. He got to thinking something might be outside his tent, and that's when he seen a large figure with dark hair standing in front of the moon in silhouette. But we finish with the craziest claim, that of naturalist Alexander Tunian, who was climbing alone in the Cairngorms on a 10-day hike in 1943. He would write about the incident 15 years later in the Scots magazine and would claim that a mist enveloped the mountain. It was here that a bitter wind started whipping around and he heard a loud footstep, and then another, followed by another. In this account, it would get scarier, because when he looked in the direction of the sound, he seen a strange shape come charging at him. Alexander was so frightened that he pulled out his revolver and fired 3 shots at the figure, but it continued to approach him, leaving Alexander to flee down the path. This is the last famous encounter of the being known as "And Fear Lieth More," or better known as Big Gray Man. Although over the years, some mountaineers have claimed to come across giant footsteps left in the snow, while others have reported seeing a 10-foot tall creature with gray fur, long legs, talons, and sometimes wearing a cap. In particular, in the 90s, 3 men saw a bipedal creature with an eerie face, as they described it, near Aberdeen. They spotted it several weeks later, and it began to chase the vehicle and appeared like it was trying to get in. It even kept up with the car as it was driving 45 miles per hour. Luckily, they escaped. In spite of all this, there's never been any pictures of the Gray Man. So what exactly are people seeing? The skeptical take is that it's nothing more than illusions or hallucinations, usually brought on by exhaustion and being isolated. Specifically, it's thought that infrasound, which can be generated by wind, gives climbers a feeling of uneasiness and anxiety, which then leads to the hallucinations. Others point to the Brocken Spectre, also known as Mountain Spectre, which might explain the more visual part of the mystery. This phenomenon can appear on misty mountains or even in airplanes, and is the very specific atmospheric conditions when the sun is at a particular angle and causes the subject's shadow to be cast onto cloud banks around them, creating the illusion of a large shadow humanoid figure. Others cite the account given by John himself, although he was a respected scholar whose word was deemed reputable. In the decades since, some skeptics believe that he actually told this story while he was drunk and then was too embarrassed to take it back, while a more famous variation is that John, who was at this climbing club dinner in Edinburgh, got annoyed because he was asked to speak in front of everyone, and it was unexpected. No one had told him to prepare a speech or anything, so when he got put on the spot, he made the tale up right there. But there are still some paranormal believers out there that think the Gray Man is a real Yeti-like creature inhabiting the mountains. September 1969, the steppes of Kazakhstan. A driver known only by the name N.P. Zenov was being paid to drive around some geologist who had came from Karaganda, which was not far away. The geologists were working near a village called Taraz, a 12.5-hour drive from Karaganda. It was at this small village that the driver, Zenov, was sent with one of the Russian geologists to an airport in Karazahal, where the geologist's girlfriend was set to fly in from Moscow, as the two had met in the same institute in the city there. So on the 10th, they arrived and drove through a village where they stopped to eat and waited at the airport. It's here they picked her up, as well as another Kazakh woman who was a lab technician at a nearby plant, and she was seeking a ride back home to her parents in Taraz. It's not specifically explained, but I'm guessing this woman also paid for the ride, which is why Zenov was okay with it. On their way back, they would reach another village, but they could not find the road where they had came in. The geologist looked at the map and said to stay straight on the road they were on and it should lead them home. But they would drive a further 2.5 hours into the night without seeing much of anything. They would continue on, covering about 95 more miles, and got even more lost. And because it was at night, they were not able to find a place to stop and ask for directions. This is where things would get weird. Zenov would continue driving down the dirt road when suddenly they seen a star burning in the distance, where he noted that this is typically seen near military units. And as a programming note here, what I think this implies is the red communist star that was lit up and stood near Soviet military bases. Anyways, the four now decided the best way to find their bearings was to stop near this military base and ask for directions. So they turned toward the star and started driving. But as they got closer, all they found was trenches and a forest. They would navigate through all this before finding a path covered with flattened sand, and they did not see any footprints or tire tracks. So they got back in the vehicle and kept driving, trying to follow the star, which disappeared and reappeared in different spots. They finally came up on a clearing and ran out of gas. Luckily, They had stopped to buy 5 barrels, so Zenov got out of the truck and filled it up. They then slept in the vehicle with plans to try and find their way out of the mess the next morning when there was more light. So they would sit in this cab of the vehicle and began to eat apples, since that's the only thing they brought with them on the trip. It was just then they seen the star get closer, and it wasn't actually a star, but instead, what they had been seeing was a motorcycle with a sidecar and 2 soldiers. The soldier in the sidecar, however, was carrying a pole with a shining star. They felt relieved, opened the door, and began yelling for help. When they seen the lost travelers, they took down their star, turned around, and drove off. The beleaguered 4 sadly returned to the cab and waited for morning, confused on why these people would not help them. While sitting in the cab, Zenov kept looking around, just hoping that the star would pop back up, or really just anyone that could help them. It was later on after this that a light began to shine into the rear of their truck. Zenov would turn to look to see a bright glowing object rapidly approaching in the sky. It was so high up that at first he just thought it was odd, but soon enough it started descending right toward the truck. Zenov would jump out and yell to the other passengers to get out of the cab as something was headed right towards the rear of the truck where the gasoline was stored. So they all jumped out, and this glowing object flew over the truck and made a whistling sound as it went by. The man had his arms spread out to the sides and legs stretched out as well. He flew horizontally over the cab toward the ground, passing only 1.5 feet over their heads, then flew up ahead about 80 feet, where it landed and faced them. The geologist, who must have been brave, suggested they get in the vehicle and move closer, so they did. When they got about 15 feet away, the thing soared back up into the air and flew to the side, where it then hovered in the air vertically, never wobbling once. It landed once again though, and did face them. By this point, Zenov, who was in the truck, turned around and flashed his headlights on him and drove a little closer. The geologist said to go ask him for directions, so Zenov stepped out and began walking towards him. When he got about 3 feet away, he extended his hand to greet him and said hello, but the being didn't extend his hand, instead keeping both pressed toward his torso. Zenov looked into the helmet and seen 2 pupils or points for eyes, and while looking, the humanoid shot back up into the air quickly. So Zenov looked up, and the being was hovering just a foot or so above him, so close that he could have reached out and touched him. Finally, Zenov was getting annoyed, so he said, "Comrade, please help us, we're lost." But there was no response. He did turn slowly towards him though, and then flew away again, which prompted Zenov to run back to his truck and follow him. And they did, hoping to see exactly what this thing was on the guy's back. Was it perhaps a jetpack prototype? He flew low and remained ahead, but not for long as the truck picked up speed. But then, he instantly went up at an angle and distanced himself from them. He then slowed down and they continued to follow him, although at a great distance. They soon made it back out to the highway and the sun was coming up and the being continued to fly. Soon, he disappeared into the clouds and fog. By this point, the geologist knew where they were and told Zenov they had mistakenly drove about 95 miles past the village they intended to go to. Crazy story, and it's taken from a letter written in 1984 by Zenov to a local newspaper, which somehow found its way to the UFO.com Project, an organization in Belarus dedicated to studying paranormal phenomena in the area. Zenov would finish by asking the paper how this thing was flying and still able to move at 180-degree turns at such a high speed without the flyer's body swinging any at all. He also noted the being was about 5'6", thin, wore a tightly fitted suit that had waves of silver, and wore an oval-shaped helmet with a rectangular frame made of glass, which ended at the nose level. He also noted mysteriously that he did not feel anything when the being hovered above him. There was no wind, pressure, or even any sound. In closing, he would ask the editors if there was any technology that we're working on that could do this, or even if it was possibly American-made. This is one of the more interesting cases involved in a flying humanoid, and was certainly odd as well. If it was a soldier from the Soviets, how come he refused to shake hands? and he never said a word. He also would not offer to help the lost travelers, while also buzzing over their car and seemingly trying to terrify them. Now strangely, Kazakhstan also plays host to another bizarre flying humanoid case from back in 1936, one we covered previously, known as the Kazakhstan jetpack monstrosity. And just as we discussed there, the first working models came out in the 1960s, but they weren't as advanced as whatever it was the party of four seen here that night. Of course, it's quite possible Zenov made the whole story up for who knows what reason, which leaves the final theory. Maybe, just maybe, the four ran into an alien humanoid of some kind. July 7th, 1987, in the small village of Huta, located in the Lower Silesian Voivodeship of Poland, our next strange mystery would play out. It begins with a young girl who would later go on to become a journalist, and for that reason told the story under the pseudonym of Malgorzata. She, along with her brother, would often go to visit with some friends in the local neighborhood, and it's this day the seven of them were hanging out, and it doesn't say specifically their age, but I believe they were teen to young adult. And since this was such a small forested village, there wasn't a lot to do, but luckily, this day they did have something to do, because one of them had just gotten a brand new VCR, and back then, that was huge. The party all went off together to this individual's home and began spending the evening watching movies. For some reason, the VCR just stopped working, even though it was brand new and still under warranty. This caused the group to quickly get bored and walk back outside. It's then the group decided they would go walk over to another neighbor's home that they frequently hung out with, that of Pavel. Now he lived alone in a clearing in the forest located between two towns. The group, however, had one little issue. A couple of them had motorcycles, not enough for everyone, so the ones riding decided they would take the long way around to his home, and one of these was Malgorzata's brother, while Malgorzata and a couple of other ones would take a shortcut through a footpath to Pavel's. So Malgorzata would head back to the path which cut through the forest and clearings, as she had done hundreds of times before, and every one of them knew the area like the back of their hand, as many of the locals used this place for grazing cattle and sheep. As they walked up the winding road between the hills, they would pass an old chapel and finally made it to Pavel's house, followed shortly by her brother and the others on their motorbikes. The group spent the rest of the evening here until dark, and set off around midnight to head back home. Again, Malgorzata set off with friends on foot, and her brother left with the other two boys on motorbikes. But it was on her walk home that things took a weird turn. The four tried to walk together in a tight group because it was pretty dark, but one of the friends fell behind, and his name was Peter. As they continued walking, they moved along the edge of the forest through a clearing. Peter, who had now dropped back further than they had even noticed, came running up to the group and whispered, "We got company." This startled the young four because this was a pretty isolated area, and they knew everyone in the small neighborhood, and definitely didn't expect anyone to be wandering around. Peter, though, was panicking. Malgorzata responded quickly by calming Peter down, assuring him no one was following, and instead suggested he probably seen some of the wildlife, hopefully just a deer and not a wolf. So they continued once again, and they left the clearing and entered back into the forest. And again, Peter began to panic, and he told the group, "Someone is following us." So the other three stopped and they began looking around, but just didn't see anything. And once again, she tried to calm him down, but now the group was growing nervous. They decided to join hands and walk together because it was very dark. Peter was inconsolable as he kept whispering to the three that someone is behind us, although no one else seen anything. But they quickly made it out of the forest and turned right onto a road, and it was here Malgorzata would finally see what Peter was talking about. To the left, she seen the outline of a figure in darkness, but could not tell exactly what it was. But she also knew if she said anything, the panic would break up the already tense group, and she was afraid of everyone running off in all different directions and getting lost, so she said nothing. But that would not matter, because as the group was getting closer to her home, they would come up on a large clearing which sat in front of a forest, and on the other side of that was Malgorzata's home. But in this clearing, they all saw it, an outline of a figure that they could not clearly make out, yet the one thing they all seen perfectly was a set of terrifying yellow eyes. The being was around 5 foot tall, dressed in a dark coat, and had a pointed hood over its head. They could not see humanoid legs or a torso since the dark coat covered everything, but those yellow eyes glowed in the dark, and that got all their focus. It began to move in a strange way to the side while keeping its eyes focused on the four. It seemed to make no noise as it moved across the ground, which led them to believing it was actually floating. The group were frozen, not knowing what to do. Finally, this unknown thing, which they still believed was a person, possibly just trying to spook them, vanished. After this, they fled to Malgorzata's house, which sat on a hill in a small clearing. She assumed that her brother and the other boys would have arrived by now, because although it was twice as long on the path they took, the bikers would still get there much quicker, yet they had not made it. So the panic soon set back in as the four made it to the front of the house, and suddenly, one of them spotted the creature again. It began to approach them, gliding low over the ground, and they could see the black cloak enveloping its entire body as it approached. At about 100 feet away, they all grabbed each other's hands. As it closed in on them, the yellow light began to turn orange, and this seemed to wake the four out of their frozen state, and they bolted to the front door where they began trying to open it, but it would not budge. Now, not knowing what to do, they would spin around to greet their demise, only to see the thing had vanished again. By this time, they didn't know what was going on, but embarrassingly to Malgorzata, the whole event scared her so much she had completely forgotten about her wolfhound, which always acted aggressive towards people he did not know. She rushed to the corner of the home and began to call for him, but it was then she had seen the dog, had ran back to its kennel, and was sitting there all hunched up, clearly terrified. If that wasn't enough, a fog rolled into the clearing, only covering about 35 to 50 feet of the yard, but shockingly, the being returned, emerging from the fog just a few feet away from the four, who again grabbed hands and fled the scene, but not before seeing the eyes turn orange, and just like it had been doing to them all night long, it disappeared again, only to reappear on the road about 10 feet away and vanish again. It seemed to be psychologically torturing them, so they again fled back to the home and tried to get back in, but the door would not budge. They remained right outside the door waiting. The situation was tense, but the being never popped up again, and thankfully, they heard the roar of the motorcycles closing in. As soon as her brother pulled up, she told him what had happened, and her brother, of course, did not believe it. He grabbed the door handle and simply walked in. Malgorzata was shocked. The door opened with no issue. The whole event, which lasted nearly an hour, did not make sense. In fact, that was another issue. The shortcut the four had walked was just over half a mile, while the road her brother and the others on the motorcycles took was about 1.25 miles. Yet, it took them an hour to traverse it, and neither her nor anyone else knew where the lost time had went. So what to make of this one? Well, of course, you have to start with the whole thing was a fabrication. In fact, if Malgorzata is a journalist and a short story writer like she claims, then it would be no issue for her to come up with a story like this. Secondly, are the details that she reveals the following day. According to her, one of her neighborhood friends would tell her that on the night the four seen the being, this friend had spotted a ball of light that shot out of the forest and disappeared in the sky. Malgorzata and the friend would go look in the general area of where the friend had seen the light, and there in the clearing sat a burnt circle of grass, about 15 to 20 foot in diameter. The circle was only about half a mile away from her home. But even stranger, none of the four had seen the light when they were in the forest the night before, other than the yellow/orange eyes they seen. It also doesn't help that Malgorzata would claim later on that because of this, she developed paranormal abilities. If it wasn't a complete fabrication, it's also possible that the group did see something which scared them and caused them to imagine it was much more. For example, what if it was a wolf following the group, and that's what Peter kept seeing? What if the yellow wasn't really floating across the ground, but instead it was the yellow eyes of a wolf prowling the perimeter where the clearing met the forest, hoping to attack one of them, and it was smart enough to use the fog to sneak in and attack. Everything else the teens just imagined due to their fear. And what if the door was just locked? Or, in their haste, they were pulling the door instead of pushing it? These things can happen when under so much stress and panicked. Or, what if it was her brother, or one of her brother's friends, simply playing a prank on the four? Maybe they stalked the group through the forest and had some kind of lights that glowed like eyes. It is a bit sketchy that after the being was last spotted, the group were able to sit in front of the door for a while, never seeing it again, and simply waited for her brother to arrive. He would give them enough time to pull off the prank and then make it back, which also explains why it took them an hour, while the others simply lost track of time due to fear. Of course, the paranormal theory suggests that it was some kind of UFO, alien-type creature, while some say a ghost is more likely, citing its dark cloak and glowing eyes, which could hint at the demonic world. November 1974, Castello, Italy. A woman named Giovanna Censoli was tending to the animals on the farm in which she lived. It was a typical day at first, nothing unusual, but it was within minutes of walking out to the farmyard that she seen the chickens and rabbits scurrying about and appearing to be attempting to find a place to hide. If you have ever been near small farm animals when this happens, you can almost be certain that they probably see some kind of hawk above. In fact, some of the chickens and ducks were looking up into the sky, so Giovanna would do the same, curious as to what was stalking her animals. It was then she seen something she could not believe, and put her in as much fear as her farm animals, because hovering above her house, right around the roof and about 15 feet from her, was a being who was seated on a box, and he was moving back and forth as though he was looking for something. That being was about 6.5 feet tall and was wearing a one-piece garment with green and white markings, as well as a pair of ski boots with square toes and square heels. He was wearing a helmet with a visor that covered his face, but she could tell he had eyes like a human. She also noted his foot hung down towards the roof like he planned on using it to support his weight. On the hovering box was a rod with colored stripes sticking up that she assumed was a control handle for the motor, as it produced a sharp hum. Of course she was shocked, to say the least, and began shouting for her mother, who was still inside the home, but her mom could not hear her, perhaps because of the motor above the house. Regardless of why, after she began screaming for her, the man started slowly moving eastwards across the area reserved for wheat threshing, about 65 foot wide. Giovanna would run over in the same direction to see what it was he was looking for, and it's then she saw a vivid light as big as the moon coming from the north and moving eastwards. It was then she felt a wave of heat, as well as a bit of mist around the area, which also lit up. By this time, the man stopped and began lowering like he was going to land on a haystack, but Giovanna rushed towards him again until she got about 10 feet away. This caused him to depart, flying up into the air with the light following him in the distance, where they then circled around a local cemetery, where it appeared he was going to land. It was about this time her mother, who had heard all the excitement, ran outside to see what was going on. That's when Giovanna would begin telling her mom to look out to the distance where the flying being was, and her mother simply said, "Oh, a parachutist," which at least confirmed that Giovanna did see something, but she did not believe it was a parachutist. So, what was it? On that one, I will let you decide. January 16th, 2004, Guadalupe, Mexico. Police officer Leonardo Samaniego Gallegos was patrolling the neighborhood of Valles de la Silla when he would have a shocking encounter that even his law enforcement training could not prepare him for. It was just a few hours after midnight, as he slowly made his way down the neighborhood road when he suddenly seen something big fall from a tree. He could not make out what it was, as the night sky made it appear black, and strangely, he never fell to the ground. Instead, stopping a short distance from the ground and seeming to hover, he would switch his patrol car's light beams to high and caught a glimpse of something sorta human, but obviously it wasn't. It had big black eyes, brown skin, and appeared to be wearing black clothing. Or it had some kind of black fur. That being, too, was now pretty close to the police car. The lights must have blinded it because it quickly covered its eyes and became angry and lunged at the car. It then grabbed it and began shaking it. Officer Gallegos responded quickly and started driving the car in circles in an attempt to make the creature lose its grip and get slung off the car. He then began to radio for backup because he had no idea what in the world he was dealing with. By this point though, the creature smashed out the windshield, which prompted the officer to throw it in reverse and punching the accelerator, which unfortunately ended up causing him to lose control of the vehicle and crashing it. It did work though, as the creature was gone, but Officer Gallegos would not know because he got knocked out in the crash. It was only when paramedics arrived and Officer Gallegos came to did he see the beast was gone. He was rushed to a nearby hospital to be treated for wounds caused by the crash, but while he was here, the police department ordered a drug test where it was found he was completely clean, blowing their theory that he was under the influence. They then scheduled for him to undergo a psychological evaluation where it was found he was completely fine. He had no mental illness, he had not been hallucinating, he was in all regards completely normal. Of course, the authorities were stumped and didn't really know how to approach the story. On the one hand, he was mentally stable and was not under the influence, yet his police car had been completely crushed. And to top it off, in his interview with detectives, he seemed very truthful. Because of that very reason, the story quickly took hold in Mexico and spread throughout the state of Nuevo Leon, and the press would sit down with the officer the very next day, asking him to recount the details. Speculation about what it was that he seen also spread along with the news. Some wondered if he had simply had an encounter with a huge owl. Maybe he had been a bit sleepy, and for whatever reason, this bird of prey swooped down at the windshield, causing the damage, and then the officer imagined the rest. Or what about a huge bat? Some even wondered if he had been pranked by someone who was possibly dressed up in a costume. Yet, they didn't explain how this person did all the damage to the vehicle, or how he seemed to levitate, as Officer Gallegos reported. Those were the more normal theories, but as you might imagine, it didn't take long for the more paranormal ones to pop up, like, was it a cryptid? Or some kind of paranormal entity? Whatever it was, the media put out the message, if anyone had more information, or any similar accounts, please come forward, and they would actually get a hit, because soon, a local station would get a video which would end up being called The Witch of Guadalupe. In this video, you would see what appeared to be a strange black humanoid flying over the hills just outside the city, and this has went on to become a pretty famous clip. Meanwhile, 3 officers from the municipality of Santa Catarina would come forward and report to have seen this being several times flying over the Sierra Las Mitras, which was a wildlife preserve, while another officer named Gerardo Garza Carvajal would claim in the same town of Santa Catarina he actually seen a creature standing in the cemetery which was about 5 feet tall with dark feathers or fur and had black claws. He at first thought it was a gigantic bird or bat, but seeing it had a face of a human. He said it was soon joined by another one about the same size. He ran into the guardhouse and locked himself inside until they left. But another interesting report would surface, which really happened 2 weeks before all this, when an officer named Manuel Cifuentes, who was a colleague of Gallegos, stated he had left the police station on foot when a black creature with a large stick swooped down out of the sky. Instinctively, he closed his eyes and then felt cold air, as if he had opened up a freezer. He believed the large stick was actually more like a broom that you would see a classic witch fly on, and from what he could see, he believed it was a woman. While the public was eating up the story, the town authorities were none too pleased. The mayor would be interviewed about the whole set of strange events, and he would even state, as far as Officer Gallegos went, he had been a good officer and showed good character, but, he emphasized, the police officers usually get a lot of stress, and this stress might get to someone. So he stopped short of saying he hallucinated the events, but he didn't really back him either. He specifically said that he thought he saw something, but sometimes life puts us in weird situations we cannot explain. But when the mayor got asked about the other sightings, made not only by fellow police officers, but dozens of other citizens, he declined to comment. Reports would continue to come in, but died down within 2 years. So what to make of this one? Obviously, the big thing going in this one is, it involved a police officer, one that apparently had a good reputation, as well as other officers and citizens coming in with similar reports. However, the skeptical take is pretty much what the mayor said. Maybe due to extreme stress, he hallucinated the whole thing. Others suggest that since he was on night duty, it was possible his whole sleep schedule was screwed up and he was sleep deprived, which again can lead to hallucinations. There are also some other suggestions that the drug test didn't actually test for everything, and it's quite possible he was taking something to keep him awake, which caused the visions. Alright guys, let's finish with a couple of funny ones. February 1956, Choisy-le-Roi, in the suburbs of Paris, France. A woman was making her way home around 9:30 p.m. She had had a nice day visiting her parents and was ready to get home and get into bed. But it was this night something odd would occur, as this woman, who reported this to the newspaper, yet asked for her name to be kept anonymous, was about to cross a bridge when she would notice something bright and shining white phosphorescent. She then heard a faint, hissing noise that seemed to be connected with the object, which sat about 7.5 inches off the ground. The woman was surprisingly unscared and drove up closer to get a better look. It was then she noticed a person about 4 foot tall moving near it. She immediately knew she had come across a flying saucer, because lately there had been articles in the newspapers detailing such sightings, but our unnamed woman would do something that you usually don't hear about in these kind of encounters. This lady got the sudden idea to go grab the being, who was small and thin, pick him up, throw him in her car, and take him to the local newspaper. So this woman opened the trunk to her car and excitedly went back to nab the humanoid, only to see 8 of them now were standing there. And strangely, they were standing there just looking at something on the ground. Behind them was their aircraft, which was shaped like a flattened pumpkin and had windows running around it. Inside, she would see 2 more figures. The woman remained brave and started walking towards them. It was then they turned around to see her and quickly returned to the craft, all except for one of them, the one she had intended to grab from the get-go. It was then he turned around, and she seen his black eyes which stared at her intensely. She started to get the feeling he wanted to speak. She slowly reached for him, and then a beam of light shot out from a window on the upper part of the craft and engulfed her, then paralyzed her on the spot. All she could do was move her eyes. It was at this point she started regretting her decision and realized she may have made a terrible mistake. She would lay there incapacitated for how long she did not know. But the light from the beam did begin to fade away, which allowed her to make it back to her car. Just as she started to put it in gear and escape, she once again was unable to move, and she began to hear a scraping noise that sounded metallic, which she assumed was the door to the aircraft closing. She would remain in her car for another 10 minutes, parked on the side of the road, dying to get out of there, but unable to operate the vehicle. Then suddenly, she heard a hissing noise from the aircraft start to grow louder, and it began to rise up near the tree line. It stopped for a second and suddenly flew off at top speed. She noted that the craft turned orange and then red as its speed increased. Then, after all this, she was once again able to move and operate the car. She immediately turned around and went back to her parents' home, scared. Her father told her to never tell anyone this story, or she would lose her job and she would be ridiculed and harassed forever. She would later go on to describe that they were clad in grayish-blue, tightly fitting one-piece garments, and they had large black eyes, almost no nose, but their nostril holes were visible and they had a slit for a mouth. They were slim with no muscles, with 2 arms longer in proportion than humans, as well as their heads were proportionally bigger than humans. Now that one is totally weird, but this one might be weirder. 1979, Ponce, Puerto Rico. A man named Hector Maldonado had what can only be described as one of the craziest UFO encounters ever documented. The story begins on a November morning as Hector would go out on his daily jog near the mangrove thickets of Ponce Salt, right by the sea. As he made his way down the road, he casually glanced to the side and was taken aback by what he seen. It was there he saw 5 to 6 strange beings that stood 5 to 6 foot tall. They were thin and had big bald heads with big almond-shaped glowing eyes, and even though it was in broad daylight, he could still make out the bright lights peering from their eye sockets. They had thin necks and long arms, along with long hands and fingers, and their skin was a grayish-blue color, and they appeared not to be wearing any clothing, although he did not see genitals, so he thought maybe the grayish-blue skin was actually a suit or something. But that's not even the crazy part of this story, because it would get more insane. Hector could not believe what these beings were doing. On the ground was a man about 5'9" with black hair and olive skin. He appeared to be unconscious and petrified. The beings got a hold of him by the armpits and lifted him off the ground with ease, with his feet never even touching the ground. Behind the beings was a machine sitting stationary in the air. It was big and oval-shaped, with a silvery metallic color with several lights. It hovered while making no noise. But it would get stranger yet. One of these beings was kneeling down looking at something on the ground when he got up and noticed Hector. He then pointed at him, and Hector could feel something in his head, like a voice. And Hector, who was still jogging at this point, heard the voice say in a mocking manner, "Hey, look at this one, how he's running." And to make matters worse, the alien started mockingly running quickly to make fun of Hector, as they all sat there and bullied him. Finally, he said, "Let's take him too." And the other alien replied, "Nah, just leave him alone." One can only imagine not only being in fear of these alien beings that were currently abducting one man, but they also stopped just to make fun of Hector. It was a double whammy for him. Hector would see them long enough to get a pretty good description though, and he pointed out they had big shark-type teeth, which later led to a sketch being done. Hector's bully though was not done, because after mocking him, he gestured towards him again and threw something like a big drop of water or some kind of cold liquid onto him, hitting him in the chest. It left him feeling strange, as though his body was swelling up and or was making him stiff, like a cramp. But he forced himself to keep on running, and the feeling lessened. Meanwhile, he did look back to see the beings taking the man onto the craft, but Hector was too scared to do anything about it and just kept on running. He looked behind one more time, and the craft, beings, and the man were all gone. And Hector ran the rest of the way home, terrified. He would later elaborate on the man though, citing him to be around 30 years old, slim, and wearing a 2-piece suit with a check pattern. And he didn't see his face well because he was sideways the entire time. Remarkably, or maybe not, Hector never went to the police because he was very scared, and he knew the police would have never believed him anyways. But he did admit feeling guilt for years because he knows they took him and there was nothing he could do. He would then stop jogging in that area for about 3 years when he finally got the courage to go back. It was then he realized that the spot where this happened now had changed, as the ground had now sunk in a little bit in about a 100-foot diameter, as if something heavy and large had set there. He would also claim that the Civil Defense Department were looking over the circle and interviewing people who had reported seeing a UFO in the area, and it was here he went on and told his story. What to make of these final two? Who knows, but they were pretty interesting. Alright guys, That brings us to the end of this short little video I've been wanting to do. Some of it was more funny than creepy, but I hope some of you found some entertainment with it. Goodbye and good night.